Good afternoon and welcome to the MOS Live Virtual Planetarium, where we at the Museum of Science share with you some of the amazing sights and knowledge that we have about our universe. Now today we're going to have educators bringing us live through some questions about what has happened with different nations exploring space, not just NASA and the United States. So we're going to get a little bit of a history lesson and a little bit of an exploration of what it has looked like for humans to be in space. So now I'll allow my educators to introduce themselves, and we'll check back in with your questions at the end of the program. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Talia. I use she, her pronouns, and I am going to be your educator today. I'm joined today by Anne, who is providing ASL interpretation for this session. And today is the first day of a new month, which means it's the first day of a new topic for us here at the Virtual Planetarium, and it is Space Station Month. Not just our space. This is what you think of when you think of a space station, probably. This is the International Space Station. But although this is certainly the biggest and probably the most famous space station, it's only one of a long line of space stations that have gone up into space. And this month, we're going to be talking about different space stations. So today is the first session. We should start with the first of the space stations. And the first space station actually was a Soviet space station. So if you go back to 1969, the US and NASA have beaten Russia to landing humans on the moon with Apollo 11. So the Soviet space program decided to shift its focus into another direction, where it could be the first to do something, and they chose to try and create a space station. And what they came up with is a program called Salyut, which was 7 space stations, which were in space between 1971 and 1991. And it was actually 2 programs in one. It was all called Salyut, which means salute. Also possibly firework, not quite sure about that, in Russian. And that, however, it was really 2 programs. There was the Salyut program, which was Salyuts 1, 4, 6, and 7. And they were true Salyut stations. But there was another program that ran under the Salyut name called Almaz, which means diamond. And these were military space stations that were sent to space under the disguise of the civilian program. And that was Salyut 2, 3, and 5. So here we have an image of what a Salyut module looked like. You're also going to be seeing a lot of these guys. These are the Soyuz capsules. Soyuz capsules are what Russian cosmonauts use to fly to space even today. They're still using the Soyuz capsule. And so you're going to be seeing a lot of these guys as well. And as I said, it was sort of the 2 programs, the civilian station and the military stations, Salyut and Almaz, which all flew under the name Salyut. And I'm going to say at least a little bit about each of these. Some of them have much more interesting stories than others, though. And we're going to start with Salyut 1. And this is the first ever space station. First of a long line, as we're going to find out this month. And it was launched into space in April 1971. So that is the first space station, April 1971. And it wasn't very big. It had about 90 cubic meters of pressurized space, which means about 90 cubic meters that cosmonauts could move around in. And that kind of sounds like a lot, but compare it to the first US space station, which was called Skylab. Katie's going to be talking about that next week. And it had 350 cubic meters of space inside of it. So that's a lot bigger. And if you want to go all the way up to the ISS, the International Space Station, that has over 1,000 cubic meters of space inside of it. So Salyut, pretty small. You could fit it, since we've got the Olympics going, you could fit it inside an Olympic swimming pool 30 times. 30 times. They weren't very big. Now, Salyut 1's career was relatively brief and not necessarily marked by much success. It was designed to be visited by two crews, Soyuz 10 and Soyuz 11, and neither mission ended well. Soyuz 10 failed to dock with the space station. Soyuz 11 successfully docked, and the crew spent 23 days aboard Salyut 1. This is the first crew ever to visit a space station and the first occupation of a space station. And at the time, 23 days was a new record for the amount of time spent in space. However, this mission has a tragic ending. This crew did not make it home alive. The Soyuz failed before reentry, and the crew ran out of air. And as a result, they actually grounded the Soyuz capsule to find out what happened and make sure it wouldn't happen again. So that meant there were no crews that they could send up to Salyut 1. And they actually let it deorbit. So Salyut 1 spent 6 months in space before it was allowed to deorbit and burn up. So brief career marked, unfortunately, by tragedy. That is the very first space station. Salyut 2 and 3 are the first of those military space stations, the Almaz space stations that flew under the Salyut name. And again, neither of them was a particularly successful example of a space station either. Salyut 2 actually launched in April 1973. So 2 years after Salyut 1 and a month before Skylab, the first US space station. And 3 days after it launched, a rocket stage, the rocket that actually helped carry it into space, was detached from it, but still nearby, and it exploded in space. The rocket exploded, not the space station, but that meant that the space station was up there surrounded by debris. And that debris, 10 days after launch, tore through Salyut 2, put holes in the hull, so all the air left, and actually ripped the solar panels right off of it, which meant it never saw a crew come to visit because it was actually torn apart by debris before anybody could go visit it. Fortunately, what was left of it was allowed to re-enter and burn up in the atmosphere after it had been in space for about a month. So the short, destructive career of Salyut 2. Now, Salyut 3 launches a year later in 1974. And between Salyut 2 and Salyut 3, you actually have the entirety of the Skylab program. The entire US space station program at that point happened between Salyut 2 and Salyut 3. And Salyut 3 was one of the military stations again. It's the first one that actually went up and actually got to do its job. And it did not hide its military nature very well. The space program only allowed Soviet Air Force cosmonauts to fly to it. They used military frequencies, and it was a very low space station. It was only about 160 miles up above the surface of the Earth, which sounds like a long way, but not for a space station. The International Space Station, for instance, orbits almost 100 miles, or actually over 100 miles higher than that. So this was a weirdly low space station because that made it easier to, spy on Earth, which is what Salyut 3 was doing. However, if we're going to talk about it as a space station, this was also the first space station that started to take the comfort of its residents into account. It had, for instance, a chess set, a magnetic chess set aboard. It had a library, and it had little things like a cassette deck and a refrigerator for the comfort of the cosmonauts who stayed aboard. So that makes it the first space station that they really tried to sort of make feel like a home. However, this one was also not occupied for very long. A single crew was able to dock with it, Soyuz 14, and they spent 15 days attached to Salyut 3. And once again, a second crew was supposed to visit but failed to dock. There's a lot of instances in the history of this Salyut series where the Soyuz fails to dock with the space station. It actually seems to have happened several times. However, this was the second time it had happened, and they wanted to know why. So once again, they grounded the Soyuz capsule to figure out what's going on. Why can't it connect to our space stations? And that meant that, like Salyut 1, Salyut 3 had nobody to come and visit it. And it was once again allowed to deorbit and burn up. So it stayed in space again about 6 months. So these stations so far are not staying up for very long, and they're not being occupied for very long. Only it was 23 days for Salyut 1, it was 15 days for Salyut 3, Salyut 2 had nobody come and visit it. So far, not a lot of success with these space stations. Compare this to the Skylab program, which had a crew stay for over 80 days at some point. So at this point, you can argue, maybe NASA's sort of got the edge in terms of space stations, even though the Salyut program launched first. That is going to start to change, though, with Salyut 4. Salyut 4 is another civilian station, so this is not one of the military stations. And this one stayed up for years. It was the first to stay up for years. It was in space for 3 years, just close to 3 years, from 1974 to 1977. And this is the first one where they start making major upgrades to the station. Now you might notice here, these bottom images, the one on the left, that's an original Soyuz image. You might remember that image from the beginning of the presentation. And the one on the right is Soyuz 4. You might notice there are very different solar panels on Soyuz 4 than on the old model. So this is the first time where they're learning from their past mistakes. They're upgrading the design. They're making this a more efficient station. Soyuz 4 had a lot more power to work with than its predecessors because of that new configuration of solar panels. So this one was visited by 3 Soyuz capsules, but only 2 crews. Between them, Soyuz 17 and Soyuz 18 spent 92 days aboard the station. So this is also a new record for the amount of time spent on one of the Salyut stations. And then Soyuz 20 was a mission that had no crew. So it was just a capsule with no crew, and it stayed docked to the station for 3 months, 90 days. And they did that to test the long-term health of the Salyut structure, because this is when folks are starting to think of space stations as being for long duration missions. This is the first time that we're really starting to think about these things in terms of, well, wait, how long could we safely keep a crew up there? And how long would the structure stay safe? So Salyut 4 is a big step in that direction. And as I said, it ultimately stayed in space for 3 years between 1974 and 1977. So at this point, we are about halfway through the Salyut program with a couple of the very important ones still to come. Sarah, have any questions come in along the way?
Yes, we have a question from Shane who asks, what makes a military space station a military space station?
Excellent. And that has to do with who is running it and what its purpose is. So civilian space stations they welcome astronauts and cosmonauts from many different backgrounds, and their primary purpose is usually exploration or science or something that is generally intended to be beneficial. A military station is one that is crewed only by military personnel, and its purpose is military. It's so the Almaz stations, the Salyut stations that were secretly military, they were spying on the Earth. They had cameras pointed downward, and they were flying over territories that the Soviet Union considered hostile, and they were spying on it, and they were using the sort of disguise of the Russian space program in order to do that. Any other questions, or is that the only one that's come in?
That's our only one so far.
Excellent. So there is, I'm glad you actually brought up the military stations, because there is one more, Salyut 5. And I tried to find some good pictures of this one. There really weren't any. I suppose it's not terribly surprising that I couldn't find good pictures of a Soviet military space station. But just like the previous two Almaz stations, which were, again, Salyut 2 and Salyut 3, this one just wasn't very successful. This one launched in 1976, and this one did actually do science as well as spying. It carried science experiments as well as spy telescopes. They did things like figure out how crystals would grow or how aquarium fish would swim in the low gravity that you find in Earth orbit. But it was also taking images through telescopic cameras of the Earth, which were then sent down to Earth to be developed. Some of them actually could be developed on the space station. And this one was only occupied for 67 days. So we're already backsliding, because Salyut 4 was occupied for 92 days. And once again, one of the crews failed to dock with the space station. I told you this was going to be a running theme with this series. And in this case, there was another mission that was supposed to make it. So 2 missions successfully docked with the space station. 1 mission failed to dock. There was supposed to be another one, but in this case, the space station ran out of fuel, and it was deorbited in August of 1977. So now we're up into the late 70s. There have been 5 of these stations. There has been 1 US space station, Skylab, which was operating in the early 70s. But things haven't really improved very much. You know, you've got people spending over the course of a couple of missions, spending up to like 90 days on these stations, but they're basically still the same. Not a lot of progress has been made. And this is where it begins to change with Salyut 6. This one is where space stations become a legitimate thing, in my opinion. This is the first real long duration space station. And this is where station engineering really begins to become the fine art that it is today. This is where they start to learn a lot of what is needed to keep a space station operational for long periods of time. And this one goes up in September of 1977, and it sets all sorts of precedents for how to run a space station that would go on to be used to shape how the Mir space station, which we're going to be talking about later this month, was run, and how the ISS is run today. This is the first one. It has 2 docking ports, which means you can actually have a Soyuz capsule at either end of the module, which means you can have more than one crew there at a time. So remember, at this point, the record for total amount of time spent on a Salyut station is 92 days, split over 2 missions. So that's not 92 days in a row. And the record for longest period of time at all is 84 days, which was set on Skylab, which was one crew stayed there for 84 days. Salyut 6 comes along and destroys both of those records. Over the 4 years it was in space, or the 4 years it was crewed, it was occupied for 683 days. 683 days by 6 long-term crews and 10 short-term crews. And the longest expedition stayed up there for 185 days, 6 months, and in one go, which is now standard on the International Space Station. That is pretty normal for an astronaut to stay on the space station for 6 months. But it happens for the first time here with Salyut 6. And it shattered that Skylab record of 84 days. It's also during this time that the Soviet Union starts to allow people from other countries to start to fly into space aboard their space stations. And they sent cosmonauts into space from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, Romania, Cuba, Mongolia, Vietnam, and East Germany. And these are some of the first people who are neither Russian nor American to fly into space. And all that happens with Salyut 6. It's allowed to deorbit in 1982, not because it stopped working, but because by this point, Salyut 7 had launched. It launched in April of 1982, and this one is another big step forward, although this one did have some issues. This is the first test of a modular space station. So all previous space stations, Skylab, Almaz, Salyut, no matter what kind you're talking about, they've been one large module. That's not what we use today. So these old style stations, they weren't designed to be added onto. Since Salyut 7, starting with Salyut 7, and since Salyut 7, all space stations have been modular. And they started testing this out with Salyut 7 using attaching different types of modules to its docking ports. So if you think about the space station, the International Space Station, for instance, it's made of a bunch of different modules attached to each other. And this was an idea that they started to test with Salyut 7. And it's extremely successful. So now all space stations use that model. Now this one was inhabited for 816 days over 4 years, and set a new record for the longest amount of time on the space in space at a time, with 237 days. One crew stayed up there for 237 days, and included the first French and Indian citizens to fly into space. The second woman to fly into space flew to Salyut 7. This is the only space station in the Salyut series, as far as I can tell, that's had a movie made about it, because it did actually have some issues along the way and it had to be saved by a very brave crew of cosmonauts. And it actually stayed in space for 9 years and overlapped with the much more advanced Mir space station. The final Soyuz capsule to visit actually flew over to Salyut 7 from Mir. One of the, I think the only time in history that anybody has flown from one space station to another. Now, when it came time for this one to come down, it was supposed to stay up there longer, but it had other ideas. Salyut 7 made a very uncontrolled re-entry in 1991, and it landed on Argentina. Pieces of it did anyway. Nobody was hurt, thankfully, but it was not supposed to come down that way. So this is the end of the Salyut program. It is not the end of the Salyut's program's legacy. If you don't have Salyut 6 and 7, you don't get the Mir space station. And in fact, the very first module of Mir. So this is Mir, the big Russian space station that followed the Salyut program, and its core module, it's a Salyut. That is a Salyut module. So if you don't get Salyut 6 and 7, you don't get Mir. And if you don't get Mir, you have a pretty good argument that you don't get the International Space Station. And in fact, there is a Salyut flying in space today because the very first piece of the International Space Station that went into space was the Zvezda module, and it's a Salyut. So there is a Salyut flying in space right now. And you may have heard about the incident last week where a new module attached to the space station and started firing its thrusters and made it flip around a little bit. It was Zvezda, that Salyut module, that first detected the spin and started firing its thrusters to counteract it. So Salyuts are still doing their part in space today. And that was a whole lot about Russian space stations. Sarah, have any more questions come in?
Yes, so Henry asks, what is the name of the film made about Salyut 7?
It's a Russian language film, and it is called Salyut 7. Nice and basic.
And then Tacey asks, given that the Salyut equipment was for military spying purposes, how do we know about them? Did the Russians eventually share information, or did the US learn about them from our own military and spy agencies?
I think it's a combination. There's no longer a lot of point in keeping it secret. The fact that some of these space stations were in fact military. Some of the cosmonauts who went up to them have talked about their time aboard monitoring these cameras and telescopes. So there is a rumor that one of them had a big space gun attached to it. That Salyut Set 3 might have had a giant space gun attached to it that everybody realized eventually was not going to work out well. So, you know, and I'm sure some of this is from our own intelligence agencies that has come out over the years, but cosmonauts who flew in that era have talked about their time on the Almaz style stations.
Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. So I will allow my educator to say goodbye.
Bye, everybody. Tune in next week to hear about the first American space station. That will be Skylab, and that will be my companion, Katie, who will be teaching you guys about that. So come back next week.
And if we could all say a nice thank you to our ASL interpreter. Very happy to have you here, Anne. For the rest of you who are still here, sorry that we didn't get to all of our questions, but please join us next week and every week for the next couple of months for our virtual planetarium offerings as we talk to more educators about more history of the space. All of this work has been done with support from NASA under a grant to help us continue educating the public through these virtual planetarium offerings. Now, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope we see you next week. Have a great rest of your day.